A new report from New York University asks if digital IDs are paving a road to hell. Already, supra-international organisations like the World Bank are funding and deploying digital IDs across the global south. And meanwhile, in the EU, the Commission is pursuing plans for a digital identity wallet that will give hundreds of millions of people a unique number, a bit like a barcode. People are calling it Orwell's wallet. So how close are we already to digital IDs? Already, many of us have identity documents that have a digital element, whether it's digital signatures or biometric passports. In the discussion that follows, you're going to hear from world-leading experts about this question of whether we are already paving a digital road to hell with digital IDs. What are the human rights risks? Who is funding these digital ID systems and why? We also explore how the language of development and equality is being misappropriated to manufacture consensus for digital IDs. And finally, we'll look at how in Britain, we've already beat vaccine passports, we beat Blair's ID scheme, and how we'll win again. I hope you enjoy it. Welcome, friends, good evening. I'm Silkie Carlo, the director of Big Brother Watch, a UK non-profit, non-partisan civil liberties campaign group fighting for a free future. And in fact, if you're part of this conversation live, it's because you're a monthly supporter of Big Brother Watch. So thank you. You're the reason that we're here. If you're watching it on YouTube, then you can become part of our lovely community and support us for as little as £2 a month to keep our work going. We'll put the link to that in the description. This is the latest in our Thought Crimes series of monthly live streamed roundtables or discussions. We have plenty more to come, so keep your eyes peeled on our mailing list for news about new sessions that we'll be running. But tonight, I am extremely excited about this. We have the best panel, I think, possible to get together to discuss digital ID at the moment. So I've set the bar really high there, but I think it's true. We're going to talk about current ID systems internationally and the major human rights risks associated with them. And we are looking at this through the lens of a must-read report that was recently published by researchers at NYU called Paving a Digital Road to Hell, a primer on the role of the World Bank and global networks in promoting digital ID. It's a really bold title, it's a really bold report, and I can't recommend it strongly enough. I've read it cover to cover. I've made pages of notes. It's given me loads of food for thought. It's fantastic. So we're so grateful to have one of the report authors, Katelyn Cioffi, with us. Katelyn is a research scholar at the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at NYU School of Law, where she works on the Digital Welfare State and Human Rights Project. Her research currently focuses on the development of national ID systems and their human rights impact. And she also has an incredible wealth of human rights experience and knowledge. She previously worked on strategic litigation at Amnesty International. She studied at Harvard Law School, SOAS and Brown. So I am terrified, but privileged to have her with us. And we also have the fantastic Tom Fisher, who's Senior Research Officer at Privacy International and a fountain of knowledge on digital ID, including in the UK. And Phil Booth, who is coordinator of medConfidential and was coordinator of the fabulously successful NO2ID campaign that got rid of mandatory ID cards in the UK some years ago. So we've got a lot to learn from everyone on this panel about where we are today and where things are going. I'm going to start the conversation and guide the conversation with the panel that we have, and then we will have a conversation. We'll have Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, I would say try to hold on because they might evolve as we go on through the session. And then I'll invite you to put them in the chat. But I guess, use the chat. Meanwhile, if anything's unclear or you want to talk about things, so always interesting things happen in the chat. I think this is an important time to have this conversation, not only because we've got this fantastic report that gives so much food for thought, but we've just won in the UK a massive campaign against vaccine passports, which for some is seen as an example of a digital ID backbone, or the kinds of use case for digital IDs of the future, where they will increasingly hold health data. There are also advanced plans for an EU digital wallet, which is going to be potentially quite a game changer in Europe. So this is now coming very close to home. At Big Brother Watch, we have always opposed mandatory ID systems of any type, digital or not digital, but it's going to be really useful to talk about the specific human rights risks of a digital ID system. And so without further ado, I want to start with Katelyn and the report. Now, it's a hefty report, of course, but could you outline as briefly as possible what you looked at and what you found, what you think the main takeaways from your research was?
Sure. Thanks so much, Silkie, and thanks so much for having me here for this discussion and this opportunity to talk about the report, and with Tom and Phil as well. It's a great panel. So thanks very much for organizing this and giving us this opportunity. So this report, which, as you noticed, has a kind of a provocative title. It asks the question, are we paving a digital road to hell with digital ID systems? And it really grew out of the work of our project, which is focused on the digital welfare state, and originally was looking primarily at countries in the global north, countries like the UK and the United States, and the digitalization of government services in these countries. But what became really clear through this work and through our interactions with a lot of different civil society organizations and activists around the world is that concerns around digital ID are really a global problem now. There are a lot of transnational dynamics that have come into play. There are a lot of similar systems popping up in different countries, even given radically different contexts. So our project really started looking at digital ID in depth and published a major report last year on the impact of the system in Uganda on certain rights to health and right to social security. But I think what becomes really clear if you are engaged in this field for a little bit is that the World Bank seems to be playing a kind of a central role in a lot of these discussions, and particularly this one kind of team that exists there called the Identification for Development team. And their influence can be seen in kind of lots of different ways. They're often the first citation whenever a discussion about digital ID comes up. They've produced this kind of headline figure about 1 billion invisible people around the world who don't have access to digital ID. And they've played a really key role in articulating the value proposition for digital ID and in trying to sell the idea of why these systems are good and why they're necessary. So that was really the starting point for our report. And it asked a few key questions about the role that the bank has played, particularly the role of ID4D, but also the bank as an institution, in the development of what we see as a kind of a very coherent development agenda around digital ID systems. And the questions that we were trying to ask in the report is, first of all, where are we on the evidence of human rights impact for these systems? What do we know about them? What have been the experiences in different countries, particularly looking at so-called exemplar countries like India, where the system is, now longstanding. It's often cited as a good example that has achieved massive scale in a relatively short amount of time. But there is a lot of evidence that these systems are leading to human rights problems. So that was the first kind of finding of the report, which isn't really a finding per se, because I think it's well known now amongst experts, and we drew a lot on the work of others in this report as well. But really to establish that there are human rights problems with these systems in the countries where they have existed for quite a while. And we can see that on a whole range of different services, on different rights, and on different aspects of political, social, and economic life. So the concerns are broad. They tend to be quite similar in different contexts. And there is now quite a robust evidence base for those human rights issues. The second question is, what is the development agenda around digital ID? What is being advocated for? And the report discusses an idea about economic ID, or a transactional version of identification that people like the World Bank are really pushing for, and tries to give a sense of what that agenda is. And the final question is, who has been responsible for implementing this agenda? Who are the most powerful actors? Who are the people who are really pushing for these, and how have they done so? So we look particularly at the World Bank through its financing, through its intellectual, thought leadership activities, and try to understand a bit, what are the dynamics that are at play here that are pushing for these systems.
Fascinating. A lot of my reading about the World Bank relates to some of their activities in the 80s, 90s, structural adjustment programs, displacement of local economies, environmental destruction, displacement of indigenous people. I've never really seen them as a benevolent organization, but they make ID sound so good. Can you headline what the main human rights risks are and why we should peer through the development narrative?
Sure. I think the implication of our title and why we chose it, right, is that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I think that's what you really see at play here, is the development language and the human rights language that has been wrapped around these systems is really compelling. When you read the reports, it does seem like this is going to be a good development. I think there are a lot of specific human rights risks around specific rights, particularly around questions around nationality, citizenship, obviously a lot of concerns around privacy. A large chunk of evidence is now in existence around the issue of exclusion, particularly from social and economic rights, the use of these systems for discrimination. But I think it might be more helpful to think about these risks in kind of three different buckets. And the first risk, I would say, is kind of an ignorance risk. So we just don't know a lot about these systems, whether or not they work, a lot about the underlying technology, the way they're designed and implemented. And actors like the bank haven't really been willing to engage in kind of evidence-based decision-making about these systems. So we're really quite blind in a lot of cases about whether these systems are functioning even as they are intended to do so. The second is about those specific human rights risks, the specific risks around privacy and surveillance that are attached to digital systems, the risks of using centralized databases. There are known now risks around human rights. And then I think the third risk is about, the intentionality and the purpose of these systems, and really what role we want identification to play within governance and within society. And it really links back then to the human rights framework of questioning whether these systems are necessary and proportionate. And I think what we've seen in a lot of the research and a lot of the cases that we looked at is those questions aren't even being asked. They don't even get the attention that they deserve. So it's difficult to even answer them. And I think that is the core of the human rights risk, is these systems are being designed and implemented, but they are not being given the proper diligence and safeguards that even our, existing human rights framework offers.
And that comes across really strongly in the report. Now I want to roll back a bit and bring Phil in to talk about the No2ID experience and Tony Blair's National ID project. Now, Phil, we should talk another time. We should host another thing where we can just talk for a very long time about the No2ID campaign, because I think it's actually really important for campaigners to learn from. It was so successful. It was a real moment in our politics. And I think also defines the kind of British attitude that we have towards ID, at least domestically. I think, as the report shows, actually, we've got, don't seem to mind pushing ID systems in the global south. Can you briefly outline to people who might not be familiar, what was the No2ID campaign? What were you fighting? And ultimately, how did you win?
Sure. So No2ID, I pre-existed my involvement in it. The scheme, as you said, was brought forward by Tony Blair, David Blunkett, initially as an entitlement card scheme, and it's not dissimilar to the development narrative that we're seeing. Yeah, it's going to help people, but in responding to that, the government realised we were going to take it as an ID card scheme, whether they liked it or not, and that was the legislation that was brought forward. I, joined No2ID literally by turning up at a meeting, not dissimilar to this, but at the LSE, and went to the pub afterwards and found myself coordinating the whole campaign 3 days before the actual bill hit Parliament. That bill was a version of something that's been sitting around in the Home Office since we lost ID cards after the Second World War in about the 1950s. Yeah? The Home Office always wants ID card, and so does the rest of government. But of course, the card has moved on. We were fighting not just a card, we were fighting a national identity register, a centralised biometric database with about 50 fields of data in it that would have been mandated to be collected from everyone. That is what ultimately killed. It's a long fight. We created an organisation, 100,000 plus supporters, 50, 60, 70 local groups, always active throughout the campaign, and managed ultimately to get the first act of the incoming coalition government was to repeal the Identity Cards Act and to literally physically shred the hard drives that had ever been touched by any of the data behind it. That was also the period during which Aadhaar was beginning to surface. Friends from India came over to sort of talk to me and to Edgar, LSE and others about how they might try and resist it, but it looked like a very, very difficult problem. And we were neither were we Indian, and couldn't speak for other people necessarily. And we had already focused ourselves, No2ID, much wider on what we termed the database state, which is what we defined as that tendency to try to run or control people's lives by manipulating their data. Yeah. We focused pretty much primarily on state initiatives, like I say, Home Office, whichever government is in, is still running the same machinery. But more lately, as possibly people know, we are looking at whole systems here. Governments use software, they use corporations, they work with the stuff that other companies collect. It's the whole system that we have to look at now, and which we have to organise to defeat, frankly.
So thinking back to what the context was like during that fight, it was quite the narrative was quite heavily around counter-terror. The proposal emerged shortly after 9/11, and I think was then catalysed again after 7/7. Again, good intentions were given for an ID scheme. They were questioned. Why was it? What did you make of the justification and narrative that was being given at the time? And why was this so important to you? How would you summarise what the risks are, as you saw it, of this massive ID scheme?
So, to take the first point first, the government had a roughly 5 arguments, as you say. Terror, anti-terror was one of them. Benefit fraud was another, coming from the entitlement end of things. And it just had a list of things which it said were its reasons, and we simply destroyed them with evidence. To the point that when I sort of joined No2ID, someone else's poll, I think a Times poll, possibly a Telegraph poll, said that 80% of people were in favour of ID cards. Yeah. By the time of the London tube bombings, that was down to about 50%. And while it went up a couple of percent, it never recovered and continued on down. And the Home Secretary at that time, Plunkett had gone, there was a chap called Charles Clarke in charge. He himself said on the day after the bombings, he said ID cards would not have stopped this or any terrorist incident. What we fought was government spin, PR, ridiculous claims with facts and evidence and building up a voice. It wasn't just us. This was getting our local groups who had one single goal, which was to make the case against ID cards or the ID card scheme and the database state disproportionately well represented in your area. That's all a local group had to do, and they did it brilliantly. Yeah, and we were coming at the government out of the local papers, at events, and all these other things. So, you have to organise, but there is something that everyone can do. We even literally wrote a handbook to help people do it. And we were just posting out, 9 kilos at a time, leaflets for them to use, in their local sort of, Saturday stalls and what have you. There's a lot of activity you can do. We don't need to go into that. What we had to do was defeat their arguments with evidence, which very much sounds like what Katelyn and this report are doing and beginning to do and must continue to do, because that's the only way you win. If you protest because you don't like something, no one's going to listen.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, because when we were having the debate about COVID passes, a lot of our opponents would always say that they didn't want to get into the evidence base. We don't want to go there because it's contentious. So let's have a principled discussion about, do we want to have IDs or not, which I always fought back against. I want to bring in Tom now. Tom, you actively, this is one of your core areas of research, and I know you've been involved in the kind of very long consultation process that there's been here in the UK about the digital ID framework. Could you explain that to everyone, please, and what the current state of play is?
First, I should say, that I've worked with civil society organizations around the world, in India, in Kenya, all these kind of systems. And what I've found deeply distressing is that the work done by NO2ID, 15 years ago is still extremely relevant today. And the arguments they make are still relevant in all these different contexts. So the same arguments, the same positions come up around the world. I think that the UK government, in its development of its systems, it's always continuously trying to persuade everyone that they are not building a biometric ID database of everybody along Blair's model, which is which to an extent is true. They're not they're going towards different models of ID focused on how you establish who you are, in the digital realm, to access government services, as well as within the private sector to establish who you are. So there's a very different goal and aim there, not so much the national security push. But you have to remember there's lots and lots of ways in which a ID system can potentially go wrong. And there are other ways that this can potentially lead to harms. People are excluded, people are exploited, and issues surrounding surveillance. So they're building at the moment something called the Trust Framework, mainly focused on the private sector, in which the government's role is basically just setting the rules of the road and letting private companies either be identity providers who are the ones to say, yes, this person is Tom, and the relying parties who can check their details, check their things, as well as a single sign-on for government for accessing government services. So having these multiple projects on at once, it's not always entirely clear, dealing with multiple departments and things like this, but it's building off work done, after the collapse and the deletion of the biometric database, the pushing of civil society organizations into beginning to look at how these things, should be done. Mm-hmm. Just to quickly mention some of the dangers going on. Exclusion is a huge one. It can be relatively straightforward for people who can be online and have got a passport or driving license, can then use that to access things. But there's still a good 20% of people who lack these documents, people without paperwork, and these are people who are often excluded from society in other ways. We're very concerned about are these systems going to lead to exploitation of people's data by the private companies who are there, both the data you give them, but also the kind of the metadata of identity transactions, which reveals so much about our lives. And that's particularly because it's not clear whether anyone can actually make any money out of this without exploiting. Because the identity providers will charge the companies checking someone's details. But is that enough to actually do this? I mean, we're entering into the unknown here, and it's not clear to me that anywhere in the world has done this. And then there is the ever-present threat of surveillance is still there, and you have to be concerned about what access, for instance, the state could then ultimately have in these kind of systems, particularly because you've got so many different parts of the of government who are involved, and when you've got an organisation like, say, the Home Office, who is both enormously powerful over people's lives and also is likes being intrusive, to put it bluntly, and also is often inept, developing that kind of trust in a system which may involve them or their data sources, really I find challenging.
So it's basically the current digital ID framework that is being developed in the UK is more or less a kind of, it sets standards for what private digital ID suppliers must meet. Is that the best way of simplifying it? And I guess in doing so is trying to kind of stimulate a digital ID economy.
I think that's a good summary of the kind of the trust ID, the trust framework. The minister at the time put it, using the same ID to buy a beer as you used to buy a house, without realizing these are actually completely different use cases, and not answering the question, why would you want to do that? And I think that the problem here is we see these ID schemes you see around the world, they create their own reality where suddenly you need these IDs for more and more things. And particularly because you remember that those who demand the ID from you, online or off, are the people who have power over you. And when these systems link together more and more data sources, that you can show these kind of verified credentials about yourself that link back to data held by governments or companies. It's hugely tempting. Then we see this expansion of the times when you actually need these kind of systems. So things that we can do today, where they maybe trust us enough to enter your date of birth on a form, or type in your email address to access the Wi-Fi in the coffee shop. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, they might trust what you're saying. When you build these digital ID infrastructures, suddenly everything has to be kind of verified. Everything can then tie back to these other data sources. And then maybe your survival strategies, your ways you avoid you avoid giving out your identity, either to avoid junk mail or for other reasons you might have. You have less and less opportunity to do that. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of a set of dangers of the expansion of these systems. Even if you don't have a government that has access to a database about all these things, it still creates these kind of sets of risks and dangers that we have to be aware of.
Absolutely, completely new power dynamics, really. We're on the edge of a question about why. I think about we refer to some of the ways in which these systems can be politically exploited. There are certainly commercial interests. I want to get a bit more into the why question. Like, why are digital ID schemes being pressed so much, pursued so much, absent the evidence base, as Katelyn's report so coherently outlines? And this is one of the sections of the report I found fascinating. I think when you want to answer the why question, it's helpful to look at the fund, especially where the World Bank is concerned. It's helpful to look at the funding. And so here's a really interesting part of the report. I'm going to throw out some of the statistics that are included. So since 2016, the ID4D program, which is this kind of part of the World Bank that is pushing ID for development, has received over $90 million in donor commitments, and also $67 million in funds. The initiative was launched with a contribution from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in 2016 of just over $10 million. They had a $2 million contribution from the Amidia network. The Australian government has contributed. The UK government has contributed through DFID, the Department of International Development, £15 million in 2019. And the largest single supporter is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which has contributed $27 million. And the question that's just ringing in my head is why? Katelyn, do you have any insights on that? Like, what is this purely commercial? Are there overriding political interests? How do you unpick this why question?
Yeah, I think there are two layers to it. If you ask me why, according to their official documentation, I think you'll see the same inclusive development agenda that we've been talking about. You know, the same laundry list that Phil said was given in the UK of, you know, here are all the things that the system will do for you. Here are all of the great development outcomes that it will contribute to. They're all speaking the same language when it comes to sort of public facing material. I think if you read the reports from FCDO, from DFID, for when they decided to invest, you know, they cite extensively World Bank publications. They're basically just continuing the loop, essentially, of identification for development, repeating back the same argument that the World Bank has given to them, essentially, as a justification for why they're funding the bank. So there's an intense circularity in a lot of the arguments. I think if you dig a little bit deeper, I think that digital ID systems fit very well into certain policy priority areas for some of these funders and some of these governments. So, you know, if you look at Bill and Melinda Gates and Omidyar as the kind of the private funders here, and you look at where their programming has developed over time, you know, the Gates Foundation has a huge range of projects that concentrate on financial services for the poor. So they've really made financialization and access to the formal financial services as a kind of core assumption of how you're going to alleviate poverty. And you know, you can really pick apart that rationale and question whether that's a legitimate assumption, but digital ID kind of plugs into that. And they also have an intense relationship with certain actors in India. So the Aadhaar system, which is really the kind of the inspiration for a lot of these international efforts, you know, is spearheaded by a figure called Nandan Nilekani, who is, you know, one of the founders of Infosys, is a personal friend of Bill Gates. And I think that there's a real coherence in a lot of the policy choices that have been made about how do you actually alleviate poverty. You know, there's a preference for certain kinds of policies, and digital ID is seen as a way of making those things easier. And I think one great example is cash transfer programs, which is something that DFID or FCDO has certainly expressed a huge preference for, that this is how they want to deliver humanitarian aid. This is how they want to deliver development funding. But we also know that there's a real fear that these are, you know, magnets for fraud, that, you know, people are going to be taking advantage of essentially the largesse of the donations and of the state, and that if you don't have a very kind of harsh system that will weed out some of those problems through targeting criteria, through, you know, digital systems, that there will just be so much wastage and leakages that will happen. So you need this kind of punitive system essentially through the digital ID in order to make that programming work. Yeah, that's the assumption. I think when you start to ask where the evidence base is there, it doesn't really exist, you know, or at least no one's done the scoping work to say, here's the extent of the problem, and here's how we think the system will play into it. But I think that just shows the way that these systems have been justified and the way investments in these systems have been justified by some of these other actors.
Yeah. Phil, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, sure. And I agree with everything that Katelyn just said, but it should be understood that every system at population scale that involves people, every IT system that involves people at that scale is or will need an identity layer at its heart. Yeah, it is just a fact that technology discriminates. That's what we use it for. We use it to sort things. Yeah. It is inherently discriminatory. It is a tool of discrimination. That is what it is. And it's especially so of things like AI. Yeah? They simply spot patterns and follow rules. And in order for those processes to manifest themselves in the world, you have to link what the output of what the computer says to a person in a bag of flesh that is actually walking around. Okay, so the question for me is not so much who is funding this, or and Katelyn is absolutely right. You can point to all of this stuff, yeah. But unless you appreciate that there are only ever going to be, systems, you have to start to redefine what it is you want ID to be and how it is allowed to be manifested, which is what we did after NO2ID with the Privacy and Consumer Advisory Group, which have an office, which I know you attend. You can't just sort of say it's someone else doing this.
No, I think it's
just a problem. Yeah?
I think that's right, but I think the funding is so important and interesting, and I think what's illuminated in the report is that it has led to this being presented and catalyzed in a certain way.
And I think absolutely that.
Yeah, and I think
that's what I'm saying. It is how they do it.
Yes, yeah.
Is the important bit, and that's
absolutely
where the funding and the policy bit and everything else comes in.
So let's come on to that. Just one sec. Let's come on to that. But I think this question about the funding is so important because the plans are advanced in a really significant way, and the Aadhaar system in India has, on I think all accounts, resulted in probably deaths. I mean, it's been seriously harmful to a lot of people at risk. And so we have different conversations about digital ID in the UK, where we have the luxury of thinking about, the politics of it, than are happening in the global south, where it might be a matter of survival and sustenance. And then you really need to ask the question, why is this happening so fast? And I think when you look at the funding, you also look at the ideology that underpins it. And one word that really stood out to me that Katelyn used was, I think, financialization, or at least the view that to alleviate poverty, it is this kind of financialization that does it, and also a certain type of capitalist view of poverty. I could go on to a whole other thing there, but it's given me a lot of food for thought about more generally some of the activities of the World Bank and how they have approached poverty for decades, and quite often in many scenarios perpetuated really extreme harms, and yet benefited some of in particular America's capitalists. But you're right. I mean, let's just go on to as the last question. Sorry, Tom, I'm going to bring you in just one sec, because I'm going to go around to everyone now with the last question to wrap up this bit before we open to Q&A. And I think it's just off the back of what Phil said about, I'm going to refer to it as inevitability, but the point being that the reality is now that all governments have huge databases and national systems for cataloguing people. These could be backbones to identity systems. Most of us, especially those of us who are technologically engaged, use digital ID of some kind, or at least we do different kinds of digital identification things, whether it is online banking, signing contracts online. We have passports that are for the most part now biometric. So how much is this about, how much is the digital ID debate about what kind of way are we going to tidy up something that just is happening? And to what extent is some form of nationwide, perhaps even wider digital ID inevitable? I'm going to start with you, Tom, so you can also pick up on the point you were going to chime in on.
Yeah, I just wanted to I just wanted to emphasize the importance of this within the UK to suggest that that these systems do risk killing people because so much is linked to the benefit system. Is going to be one of the key elements of any government system. And as we saw, we have our own challenges with issues surrounding people proving citizenship with the Windrush scandal. So the stakes, even in the UK context, are very high. I also want to make one observation. I recently got back from Norway, where they have a population register of everyone where they live, their names, details, and things, and they are still struggling with digital ID. How to move this into the digital realm is a struggle for them. So don't think that if Tony Blair had his way and we had an ID card, we wouldn't still be having the long debates about how to move this into digital realm. We absolutely would. There's not any kind of simple solutions here. There's it is a very, very hard problem to get right, and this is one of the major issues with, for instance, the World Bank, who portray this one single model as the only option as to how it's done around the world, which is then taken up by other organizations who then introduce this. Whereas what we really need to do is look at what are you trying to do with this identity system. It's not an end in itself. It's a way of achieving a policy goal. It might be necessary, it might be unnecessary in different contexts. But when you have this as your goal, we want to build this identity system without having in mind why, then it can't possibly be compatible both with the rule of law and human rights and data protection, all these things. Because key to that is the purpose, and that's the only way you can know whether it is necessary and proportionate.
Thank you, Tom. Katelyn, do you want to come in on this question around inevitability and how that is part of the, as you put it in the report, the manufacturing of consensus, the kind of foundation for that, for the ID4D program, is that this is an inevitability to some degree, and certainly if there's going to be equality, it has to be an inevitability. What are your reflections on that?
Yeah, I think I fully agree with what Tom's just been saying, is that what is inevitable and what is actually up for contestation has been completely obscured by a lot of these discussions. And I think that's the most harmful part of the manufacturing of this consensus, is that a lot of the debates that should be happening are being choked out because of the strength of this narrative. And I completely take Phil's point about, there is a need often for systems of identification. If you want to run these wide scale projects, then you need to often have some of these tools at your disposal, but they don't need to look a certain way. They don't need to look like ADAR. The report talks a lot about, the importance of CRVS or civil registration, which is something that, human rights activists have been advocating for a long time, the importance of birth registration and having a birth certificate. But that rights-based model is not at all what we're talking about here. We're talking about a very specific model of system that is, meant to be applied to so many different areas of social life, and that is meant to use specific tools. Biometrics, the bank will always claim that they don't advocate for biometrics in every system, but they appear in almost every system. So I think we're looking at a kind of a specific subset of identification systems that I don't think are inevitable. I think that you don't need this foundational system that will achieve every single aim, because it does make it impossible to have those discussions about what is necessary and proportionate, because you're at such a high level of abstraction where you have to debate all of these different aims together as though they all require the same system. And in many cases, they don't. And I think, just as a kind of a final remark here, I think when you talk about inevitability, I think there are a lot of assumptions that are built into that inevitability that need to be unpicked. And one that I find particularly pervasive is this idea that fragmentation is bad always, and that you have to have the most efficient system possible, that efficiency is the core value that we're pursuing. And I think if you live in a democratic, human rights-based society, efficiency is not the core aim, right? You want a system that will safeguard rights. And so I think the idea that, the only system is one that just uses these tools to be as efficient as possible, rather than saying, how do we safeguard rights? Maybe it will cost a bit more, maybe there will be more fragmentation, but it will lead to a more robust base identification ecosystem. I think that needs to be much more part of the conversation, and that will break through some of these ideas that we're hurtling towards any sort of inevitable kind of Goliath of a system.
Yeah, I completely agree on the need to unpick some of those underlying assumptions. I would recommend to everyone, if there's even one section of the report that you decide to read or to read first, I would read the manufacturing consent part of the report, because it's just so illuminating, I think, and really, really well written. And as we're talking about the risks of these digital ID systems, I'm also reminded of the way that you put in the report that the risks are basically neutralized in their narratives, because they're always framed as risks to the success of the system rather than to risks to people and risks to rights. And risks are also presented as manageable through implementing the system. So, like when a risk is acknowledged with the digital ID system, the way to, for example, with, let's say, exclusion, the way to deal with it is through including everyone. It's just taken as a given that hard and fast implementation of the system will solve all of the problems. And there are just so many underlying assumptions beneath the whole narrative. So Phil, I'm going to come to you to answer this question as well now, before we open into the Q&A for the last 10 minutes. But also, I think you've got a very interesting way of thinking, in a very formulaic, simple way of thinking about the kinds of conditions that you'd look for in a digital ID system of sorts, or in the way that government deals with identity, that I would be really grateful if you could share that too.
Okay, I will. I'll share something else on the way there. But just to make it very, very clear, what I do with medConfidential, while we are trying to ensure that every use of patients' data is consensual, safe and transparent, was a deliberate choice to go and try and fix a system that was based on the World War II ID cards. Okay? The original NHS number was your World War II ID card number, with 1 or 2 or 3 a digit added at the end, depending whether you're the father, the mother, or a child, or whatever. Okay? So, people call me a privacy campaigner, people call me a health campaigner, whatever they are. I have and always will be an identity campaigner, because I understand systems. Now, how we've held government off of doing an identity system for most of the last decade, since we won the ID cards battle in 2010, is by something I mentioned just briefly before, the Privacy and Consumer Advisory Group, which issued principles. These principles are the features that we decided, those people who looked at the old ID card system and looked at ID systems in general, decided needed to be characteristics of a safe ID system. These are quite technical. I don't expect everything to make sense to people, because it's a long and complicated sort of battle. But my 4, if you like, bits of the recipe that I think have to be met by any system at any point for a minimum viable functional ID, but safe, it must work on paper, not just devices. As we saw with the COVID pass, which we insisted there was a paper version of, so that people didn't have to install invasive software onto their mobile phones or what have you. It must work on paper, especially for the global south. Yeah, not everyone's going to have a device for many, many years. The system must address both institutional risk assessment, which is one thing, and human trust. Very much like the human right of privacy is nothing like official secrecy, which governments have, and commercial confidentiality, which corporate persons have. Yeah, there are two things here that are being munged together, and they must be detached. Yeah, you don't get human rights out of risk assessments. Okay? The third one is that any system must give the individual, the person whose identity it is, meaningful control over what's called the level of assurance. That is, how much they have to show to prove something. Yeah, that's what we mean when we say credentials. Yeah, talking about identity as a whole thing, yeah, is a part of the problem, and what the World Bank and others actually want to make you think. When what in fact you might need to prove is I'm over a certain age, I'm over 18. That's age verification, or I am a citizen of this particular sort of country, or resident of this particular town. That is not an identity question. That is a credential question, and it should be down to the individual to be able to decide what they reveal. That's in line with privacy, sharing of secrets. And if you don't, you are just basically saying, well, it's a global tick box privacy policy on ID that we're building. Yeah. So, that's quite a technical point, but it's absolutely fundamental. And the final one is it's my identity. No one's disputing that they're trying to identify me. Yeah. Okay. So I say, if that is true, then in order to make your system abuse resistant, we can never prevent all abuse, but we can make it resistant. Well, your system must be transparent to me. Yeah, I must be able to see everyone who's checked my identity. Yeah, and that will actually cut out a lot of the problems. We've done this. We've got personal data usage reports in the pipeline in the NHS, and this is what will help people identify when someone's been peeking around in their medical records, like the creepy single doctor looking up a date or something, or officials, people who have authorized access, being able to get into your most private stuff. Those are four things. They may not seem obvious, and they certainly don't attack the arguments that the World Bank may be using and the justifications. But if we can get to a point where people understand that these are the essential properties, because I hope most people would agree that those things sound sensible, then I think we might have a more of a fair fight.
That's excellent, Phil. Thank you so much for sharing that. And obviously, I know that you've worked in this area for such a long time and thought about this so much. That is it's a very simple way of putting some very important principles. I appreciate that a lot. It also makes me think about how much of the issues that we have with digital ID and mandatory ID more widely are as much about political questions around what credentials are being requested and required when and why. For example, the fact that we basically now have border checks in schools, or that we ended up having COVID checks everywhere.
The sixth, right to work and right to rent checks for everyone. The thing that Tom was talking about actually affects everyone in this call right now. If they wish to rent a property or change job, they are now exposed to a Home Office right to rent, right to work, online checking scheme. Yeah,
it's It's the normalization of these checks, and it can even be, like maybe biometrics to get into your workplace. It's filtering all throughout society, and I think that's one thing that at Big Brother Watch we really try to warn against. Like, don't ask for people's IDs or credentials unless you really, really need them, because of the risks involved. Okay, we're going to go to questions. We've only got about 5 minutes left, so we're going to have to be really quick, and we may run a little bit over time if that's okay, because there are some really good questions here. But I think we're just going to try and be brief in our answers. I'm going to start with one from Ian, which is an excellent question, about how increasingly health justifications being given for digital IDs. Obviously, we've had this in the wake of the pandemic. How much more dangerous might that be, and how much more difficult might it be to resist? He also says, Phil, great to see you are still active. Who wants to jump in? This is a free-for-all now, so panelists, just jump in, please.
And just quickly, yes, it's a risk. We have a thing called the NHS app. Forget the contact tracing stuff. This is the one that you go and check your GP sort of prescriptions and things like that. We are told that 40 million accounts have been created for that, and maybe 20 million or so have been actually verified. That's because they put the COVID pass behind that firewall. Yeah, they will use the thing that you want. They'll use your very freedom, to get them onto the system. And that's why I would, like you, Silkie, I would always encourage people, because this is actually basically down to us. We have to respect our own privacy. First. We can talk about protecting everyone's, but if you just basically go along, then that's a part of the problem, whether it's convenience or nudge or, as Katelyn's described, any one of the number of sort of good reasons that people might give. Respect your own privacy. Choose the least invasive option, and we, people like us, will hopefully keep on fighting to keep that minimum viable thing available.
Thank you, Phil. Tom, Katelyn, do you have any responses on this question of health as a justification for ID? Katelyn?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a massive risk, and especially, I think Phil makes a great point. I think what we see a lot in countries in the global south is that the system is designed to be coercive, to pull people into the system. And how do you most efficiently do that is you target the services that people really need. So it's not a coincidence that often, welfare payments, health services, things that are really necessary, especially if you're vulnerable or marginalized, are targeted as early use cases as a way of pulling people into the system, because it creates an untenable choice to say to someone, if you don't access the system, you can't access healthcare. That's not a choice a lot of people can make. So they will access the system, and that's not any sort of meaningful consent. And the other risk is obviously to use these moments of emergency, of things like the pandemic, to build systems that can then be used for other purposes. And that's the whole, reason behind having a foundational system, is you're trying to pull as much information and data and people into the system as possible, and you will use the opportunities that arise. And once that data has been collected, that data is now there. It's under the control of whoever has collected it, and it's often very hard, especially in countries that don't have robust data protection policies, to then backtrack on those systems once they have been established. So I think it is a huge risk, and is a dynamic that we're certainly seeing play out in a lot of other places as well.
Tom, do you have any thoughts on this?
I really think it's right to highlight the spread of digital health around the world emerging out of the pandemic without enough kind of time or consideration to see what that really means and how it should work. And there are cases from India of people with HIV/AIDS not seeking treatment because they're afraid of it being linked to their Aadhaar number. But I just want to highlight one positive, more positive example. We worked with an organisation in Kenya called Katelyn, where there was a plan who worked with people with HIV/AIDS, and when there was a plan to link treatment to biometrics pushed by not only the Kenyan government but also UN agencies. These people, often extremely marginalized, and fought back. They said, no, we're not engaging with this project. And they got a change in that requirement for biometrics. So, we do see fightbacks around the world by civil society, and they can be successful.
That is really positive. I wasn't expecting positivity in this hour. That's really good. I hope we see pushback in the EU about this digital wallet, because it sounds like some of this, what's going on with that is frankly nuts. Just reflecting on the health the pandemic being used as kind of justification for that. There was a good write-up in Politico recently, and there was this one line that really stood out to me, where Politico report that a commission official stressed that digital projects got priority in responding to the pandemic and said, "This is the impressive side of this pandemic. It's a path of no return," with regards to digital passes. And that has now helped catalyze this idea of the EU digital wallet that European digital rights groups are calling Orwell's wallet. It gives people a number that they will carry with them for the rest of their lives. It's eye-watering stuff. Okay, last question, I think, unfortunately, due to time, but I'm going to kind of bunch them because there are some similarities. Richard says, he is a good paragraph here. He essentially says, we need to form a group that could have a voice in Parliament. Hi, that's Big Brother Watch. That's what we're doing. So you're in the right place. And likewise, someone else says, and Privacy International, and medConfidential. In fact, we're all here doing parliamentary briefings. And Katelyn, your report should be read in Parliament. You should maybe do a parliamentary launch because it seriously needs to be read and considered. But yeah, I think those groups are here and giving that voice in Parliament day in, day out. Much with great difficulty. And then the other question was, so James says, what will they do with those of us who will be non-persons by not allowing ourselves to be part of the system? Will we end up on savage reservations like Brave New World? And someone says something similar about that they've tried to kind of reject this constant digital identification, but is worried that it might not be sustainable in the long term. I will probably see you over a fire on the reserve, Richard, when we reject the dystopian digital future. It's a serious question, I suppose. Actually, Katelyn, do you have any in your research? Do you have examples of what has happened in scenarios where when a system is deployed that is mandatory or made an obstacle to essential services, what happens to people on the outside of the system?
I mean, there are numerous examples from India, of course, of people literally starving to death because they're not able to access food rations or unable to access other aspects of the welfare state. There's active litigation with our partners in Uganda at the moment because of the way that the national ID has been used to exclude people from life-saving healthcare and older persons from receiving cash transfers as part of their social security and their right to social security. So I think the effects can be quite egregious, literally questions of life or death. But I do think that, we've talked a lot about the inevitability and the kind of the power stacked against a lot of these systems. But I do think that is not the kind of the takeaway that we want from our report, which is not that, this is an inevitable juggernaut and we should all kind of retreat to our reservations. I think, Phil's, very clear guidance demonstrate that there are ways of mitigating some of these risks. There are other models that are just not being considered. There are places where you might just say, we will accept a digital ID because it's important in a certain policy area. It's important in a certain time limitation. It's important for a certain policy goal. But others where you might reject it and say, here's where it's not necessary, where it's not proportionate. And I think if we want to paint a kind of rosier version of the future, I think that's the future that we're looking for, is where a lot of these discussions are actually happening. A lot of these criticisms and critiques are allowed to surface in Parliament, at the World Bank, in other countries, and that it can be much more, targeted, much more real, instead of having these kind of very abstract discussions about how tech will save us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think your work is such an important part of giving also reason for that optimism. I think I read in the report as well, there was a successful campaign against an ID scheme in Jamaica, if I recall correctly. So yeah, a lot of inspiring stuff. Final thoughts then on this and just generally from you, Tom, and then I'll come to you, Phil.
Yeah, I mean, I see from a lot of the questions, it is people concerned very much about the future here, and indeed, we work with groups who don't have access to ID cards in contexts like Kenya, who can't access health, education, have trouble moving around the country, all these kind of things, no jobs, no formal employment, and it is really harsh. And while these these systems don't have to be formally mandatory to be kind of necessary in order to survive. And as we look to the future, things like the future of cash, I think is, one area where more and more people will be forced into kind of the digital ID realm as that pushback against the use of cash in order to promote these kind of systems. But I suppose to try and end on a moment of optimism, having worked with these civil society organizations around the world, the level of knowledge and experience, both in the UK with obviously medConfidential, Big Brother Watch, and may say Privacy International, but organizations in countries in India, in Kenya, in Uganda, in Latin America, who have been pushing forward with this fight, and how they are learning from these other fights in other contexts, how the UK's No2ID scheme informs the fight in India over Aadhaar, which in turn forms the fights in Kenya, and the level of knowledge and experience of civil society, both in the in fighting and advocacy, but also how these things could be built better, is amazing. But mostly it's just not listened to, it's not engaged with enough, and that is the concern globally, which is why things like the report from NYU School of Law is so important in emphasizing the role of these organizations around the globe, which I think should be encouraged.
Yeah, thank you so much. Phil, then, last word to you.
I believe in people. Yeah? And I know one thing, they'll pick off isolates unless you happen to be a billionaire. Yeah? There are people who already live like James and Russell is describing, and those are amongst the first people that the system discriminates against. Yeah? The Roma, for example. Okay? So if you are moving yourself to a position where you are essentially inhabiting that same space, I suggest, you think about something I call the Niemöller slope. Pastor Niemöller said in the Second World War famously, and I'll mangle the words, but essentially first they came for the trade unionists, then they came for the communists and no one spoke out, and then they came for the next group and no one spoke out, and then they came for me and there was no one left to speak out. Yeah, that's why I believe in people. Yeah, and I believe in sharing problems, tackling them together. Yeah, through whatever means of organisation. I think everyone always sort of goes, "Oh, we're going to have this, we're going to have that. We need a new political party, what have you." We have everything that we need. Okay, in 2006, the day after they passed the Identity Cards Act, I made a pledge, and I asked people to join me in it. That is that I would never have an ID card. Yeah, and that we, No2ID, people supporting us, would work to defeat the scheme, and we will put a timetable on it, which was 10 years, because the thing that they were going to use to get you onto the National Identity Register, to fingerprint you and everything else, was going to be your passport. Okay? And I said to people, and through all our massive, wider network, we had supporters ourselves, but we worked with networks of people. This is what it's all about. I think my request was put in front of 9 or 10 million people. And in that single month alone, although we didn't find out for a year until the statistics came out, it looks like maybe between 40 and 50,000 people renewed their passport early, buying themselves 10 years grace for us to defeat the ID scheme. Yeah? And we did. Because when you got 50,000 people who go through the bureaucracy, pay 50, 60 quid for the privilege, just to say, I'm not going along with this, you have a voice. Yeah, you already have a voice. This isn't about, like Tom said, it's not about the future. This is about now and what we can do. Make your choices, defend your privacy, inform yourself, inform others, join Big Brother Watch, join whatever group, yeah, you can join that is going to help defend against these sorts of database state attacks. Yeah, and that's basically all it's going to take. Yeah, now defending against big interests imposing colonially on places is, I agree with Katelyn in the report, is a different problem. As I agreed with my Indian friend looking at the imposition of Aadhaar, we could see what it was going to do. We could see what it was going to do. We could see it was corrupt. We could see its full horror, which has come true. But that's in a nation of over 1 billion people with 2 major languages, three, I think, completely separate medias, structures, political structures, state structures, and what have you. And now it's got Modi using Aadhaar to make people not people through the courts. Yeah, this stuff can happen. In this country, however, I think about the best that any of our governments, Conservative, Labour, any flavour at the moment is going to manage is Terry Gilliam's Brazil. Yeah, a sort of cocked up bureaucracy. Yeah, it's sort of evil, but it's not fully 1984, nor is it fully Brave New World. They are just, we are saved in large part by their incompetence. Unfortunately, we shouldn't rely on that.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Phil, for such an inspiring message to end on, and to all the panelists for your insight, your wisdom, your knowledge, and your optimism as well. And definitely the cases where people have fought back successfully against harmful digital ID or any other ID schemes are so inspiring and so worth sharing to those of us who care about it, because the powerful narrative about inevitability can really be debilitating to activists. And so it's important that we can gain strength and inspiration from these accounts of success. And I'm also incredibly proud that in the UK we did defeat the ID scheme, and I'm proud to know campaigners like Phil that was such an important part of that. And I'm also really proud that we defeated mandatory COVID passes when we did, because that so easily could have outstayed its welcome as well. And that was a really, really tough fight. But this is a fight that never goes away. It comes in cycles, and it's one of the things that Phil and I sometimes speak about. One of the reasons I know that he does some of the work he does at medConfidential, because the health system is the backbone of any ID system. And so as ever, we must be vigilant and keep sharing knowledge and optimism, and keep learning from each other. And that is why this report is so important as well. And Katelyn, thank you so much for sharing it with us and sharing your insights. If you are watching this and you're not a Big Brother Watch supporter yet, then please consider supporting us. You can be part of our future conversations, and make sure that you subscribe to our mailing list, bigbrotherwatch.org.uk. Subscribe so that you get updates about future in-person and online events. Thanks so much to the panelists. Thanks to the attendees for making this a really interesting conversation and a really good chat that I've been keeping my eye on in the corner. And hopefully see you all soon.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.